Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Athos Life podcast. My name is Jovany Perriott, and I am with my co-host, Joe Stout, for another episode. I'm just going to start calling you co-host.
All right, sweet. Let's do it.
I'm just like, Joe Stout again. Yeah, we're doing this enough now that he's my co-host. So that's what
the assistant to the host.
Yes. I love it. So today we got a great topic to talk about today. This is something that I think Joe can talk about specifically, just with all the things that he's invested his life in. And so let's get right into it. I'm going to start off with a little verse just to kind of get our minds kind of on the topic, and then we can kind of define what we're going to be talking about today. So this is from Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 to 10. I'm just going to read the first verse. It goes much more into detail, but we'll just start with this. There's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. And it goes into there's a time to plant, there's a time to reap, there's a time to mourn, there's a time to laugh, all those types of things.
Right.
So the point of this verse and kind of what's going to set our minds for this episode is just the cycles and seasons, and then taking a balanced approach to life.
Sure.
In regards to a healthy lifestyle and fitness.
Right.
So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So we've got a great topic here, and we're kind of just going to walk through the three different aspects of fitness that I would say you need to be mentally, physically, and spiritually prepared in.
Yeah.
And you need to be fit in these areas. When we're talking about fitness, we want to always just kind of boil it down to the physical aspect of it. But I think the mental and spiritual aspects are almost more important, and they flow together. So that's what we're going to kind of be talking about today. And so let's just start off with Joe. Let's address mental first.
Sure.
And what you think would be a good preparedness or things that we could do to be mentally prepared. We can talk about study and work, creativity, and then resting. That's going to be a big topic as we're going through here, is the resting and the taking the time to rest from all the work. Because I think it could be confused in today's day and age, rest and then laziness. A lot of people I worked for 8 hours today, I'm going to go home and rest. Is an 8-hour day something that we should be resting from?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there is, but to what aspect? Do we just go home and veg out on the TV, on our phones, that type of thing? So that's kind of going to be in each of these three areas, something we're going to be talking about, rest. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things you just said is in the intro there was that a lot of times we can look at physical activity, especially in our space where we're, these are performance. Mount Athos is performance supplements. And so a lot of the people who would even be listening to this are interested in physical fitness, which is great. But to leave out mental fitness and most importantly, spiritual fitness is to actually sell yourself short, because our physical fitness is a very brief window. We should strive for physical fitness our entire life,
right?
But our physical body is going to peak at some point, and then it's going to start going downhill, no matter what we do. And that's not to say it doesn't matter. It's just to say that to recognize the limitation of the physical body, and to a certain extent that can be true for the mind as well. Certainly. We probably all know a loved one that has struggled with Alzheimer's or dementia or something like that. So there's definitely physical degradation that can happen, or a mental degradation that obviously can happen as well. But in a lot of ways, your mental muscle can be exercised far longer and in far more deliberate ways than just simply your time in the gym.
Right.
Or your time out there, jogging or whatever it is that you're doing physically to stay in shape.
Yeah.
Mental health, mental stamina needs to be worked on all the time.
Yeah.
And that's why the question I would have in my mind in terms of rest is, what is rest?
Yeah.
So not only when should you rest, but what does rest actually look like?
Yeah.
Is it actually restful to veg out on Twitter?
Yeah.
Or X, excuse me.
Yeah.
Is it actually restful, or does it actually mentally tear you down even further than you began when you started scrolling?
Yeah.
And so you need to, I think one of the things we can do that can be very helpful as we think through, there is a time and a place for each thing under the sun. There is what mental rest looks like oftentimes is not what we think. I'm not a video game player, but I know a lot of guys will sit down and they'll spend hours playing video games.
Yeah.
Which there's nothing inherently wrong with video games, but is it actually giving you the rest that you think it is? Most people are familiar with the idea that you actually burn more calories sleeping than you do watching TV. I would assume the same is probably true for when you're scrolling Twitter and
right.
whatnot. So what is rest, and when should you rest? Because even in rest, that doesn't mean that we should veg.
Yeah.
There's a difference between vegging and resting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like how do you think post like school and that type of stuff, where you kind of like have a foundation of knowledge, how much more should you be trying to educate yourself?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm working on improving in my own life is having large spaces of silence, large spaces where there is not, I live in a house with 10 kids, so there's never like true silence. But one of the things I really try to teach my kids is if you're gonna play music, listen to the music. Don't just have it as a background noise that kind of keeps your mind from, a lot of times people are like afraid to have things be too quiet.
Right.
Or they're afraid to like actually be able to hear themselves think because, well, it's intimidating. There's a lot going on. And so even especially people who struggle with loneliness, like they'll keep the TV on 24/7 because they want to feel like there's other people around. But we live in an age of just constant noise and constant information input. And so it's a really important, Cal Newport wrote a book called Digital Minimalism that is helpful in just looking at the fact that the smartphone is affecting our mental state in a way that a lot of us, it was never intended to, but it actually, we end up becoming controlled by it.
Right.
And so I think one of the practical steps we can do is try to find time where you can have silence.
Yeah.
Now, as a Christian, one of the things that I want to do in silence is I want to pray, and I want to have that be time where I am either meditating on God's word, or I am praying scriptures back to God, or I'm pouring out my heart to Him.
Right.
And that could be when I'm driving. That could be first thing when I wake up. It could be before I go to bed at night. But just seek spaces where seek extended spaces of we'll call it data solitude, where your mind is not receiving new input.
Right.
Because that's what your mind, that's actually what real rest is not putting new input into your mind and letting your mind feel free to actually drift and let your thoughts wander, or use that time and discipline yourself to pray.
Right.
But if you're just constantly getting that next, like you said, dopamine hit from that next tweet or from that last like you just got, that it short circuits our brain and it's not restful.
Right. I also think like you touched on meditation there. Modern day like definition of meditation is like an absence of thought.
Yeah.
Whereas like where it should be more of like a focused effort of thought.
Yeah.
Where you're like controlling your mind to think about the specific things.
Yeah.
How you're going to glorify God in your day. Like if it's morning or night, and thanking God for the things that you went through in the day, and then how could you do better and those types of things. And because just that absence of thought, it's like it's almost unproductive. Like
it's a Christian Buddhist crossover.
Yeah, right.
It's like where because Christians oftentimes will say this kind of very thing, but there's like this Buddhism that's mixed in where you think like, oh, it's nirvana and you just empty yourself of things, and that's not what necessarily what you're looking for at all. So you're right there. Yeah,
I think that trying to be focused, controlling your mind rather than emptying it would be the goal. Because it's sure you might have some peace with that if your thoughts are like continually like anxiety or depression or those types of things where you're just like, okay, well, I need a moment where I'm like going to clear my mind. But you should actually be trying to focus on the things that can improve those areas.
Absolutely.
Rather than,
and if you're in this, if you are a knowledge worker, or if your day to day is in producing knowledge, or you're not necessarily doing physical labor all the time, you need big spaces of silence, of silence in terms of data input for your mind to actually work through some of those bigger knowledge things that you're working through. If I'm painting houses all day, I'm going to be reading the whole time. I'm going to be spending some of that time letting praying.
Right.
But like that, there's a sense in which physical labor, it's a wonderful thing because you have the opportunity to let your mind do other things while your body does the work.
Right.
But if you're involved, if your day job is in knowledge work and there is a sense in which at the end of the day, you're not necessarily physically tired,
Right.
but your mind is very mentally
very
tired. And
spent.
the last thing you want to do is now overload it with all this crazy stuff that you
Right.
see
Yeah,
online.
exactly.
That is specifically created and designed to hook you in.
Yeah.
It's created and designed to be like mental drugs for your brain. Pornography is like the best example of this. Pornography is literally crack for your brain. If you take crack or you watch porn, both of those things affect your mind in the exact same way. And so it's like for your own mental health, even if you're not a Christian, you shouldn't do drugs and you shouldn't do porn. Both of those things are just terrible for your mind.
Yeah, you shouldn't do drugs, which is porn. Like, it's a drug. Yeah.
It's a drug, absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. And we can kind of talk about, because we talked to specifics about mental, and I think at the end we can kind of just like wrap up with the cycle of this, like what it should look like. But we'll move on to physicality now.
Yeah.
And then, so we have like diet, medication I have here, and then exercise, and then rest. So there's kind of 3 topics we can talk about in the physical aspect of fitness.
Yeah.
Diet, super important, like what you're fueling your body with. And as we're talking about like a holistic approach, a lot of people want to isolate these things into little bubbles where it's like, I have my mental work, I have my physical stuff, and then I have my spiritual, which could be non-existent in some people.
Right.
So, but when it comes to the body, you have, again, a system. And today I feel like with medication and those type of things, we're isolating these things as individual factors. And that's what medication, you're treating the symptoms, you're not necessarily treating the problem. Whereas if we're looking at it from a holistic perspective, diet, exercise, and rest should all be something that can be addressed in unison, should be addressed in unison if you're going to try and get to the root of a problem.
Sure.
How do you feel about like that area today in terms of diet and medication?
Yeah. As Christians, we know that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And there's 9 things there, but those are all the fruit. Those aren't the fruits of the Spirit. It's the fruit of the Spirit. So the fruit is all of those things. And I think it's telling that self-control comes at the end, because it's kind of like all of those previous things, love, joy, peace, patience, those all come under the guidance of self-control. So all of those things with self-control. So sometimes we talk about balance or holistic, like that holistic, making sure that you live a balanced life. But really, when it comes down to it, it's self-control is the ultimate balancer. And so self-control in what you eat to begin with. So just the amount of food that you eat, it's really important to have self-control there. When you eat, it's really important, again, to have self-control there. If you are just constantly just eating whenever you feel the slightest inkling to eat, you're not exercising self-control.
Right.
Now, that being said, it's good to eat. And I don't think, starvation diets are not good. And also obsessing over your food to where you can't even be thankful for it. That's also not good. So none of those are ways of thinking about diet that are with self-control. And personally, what I like the best is there's a lot of fads in the diet world. I have a bachelor's and a master's in nutrition. And so I see these fads all the time. And nutrition, diet and nutrition is where I've spent most of my time studying. And there's just tremendous amounts of it's just so faddish. And for a lot of people, if they're a content creator or an online influencer, you got to follow the fads because that's where the clicks are.
Right.
There's this deep irony that online influencers are often the most easily influenced.
Right. No, that's true.
But what I like and what I think is timeless and biblical is the practice of fasting.
Okay.
So in terms of diet and in terms of having self-control and not engaging in gluttony, and gluttony can be done by skinny people too.
Right.
If you're trying to control diet or control calories, to do that more through fasting, I think keto's great, paleo's great. Those are I think they're good foundational diets, and I've even done keto before myself. But I think fasting has the most historic support, and I think as far as intermittent fasting, I think is where a lot of people can benefit in a tremendous way.
Right.
In intermittent fasting, probably you know what it is. I know you know what it is, but it's just this idea of just as you would give your mind a space of where it can have a break from data input, you give your digestive system a space where it can have a break from digestive input, where you're not feeding it and it goes through a cycle where you start burning through some of your stores. True intermittent fasting is a minimum of 12 hours, but it's better to shoot, if you can, for 16-hour breaks in between eating.
Right.
And so essentially what that would look like, and you know, everybody's going to have a different situation. You might be you might be trying to put on weight, and so intermittent fasting might not be right for you in a particular season of life that you're in. But in just general, it's I like to try to hit about that 16-hour mark. Whereas if you finish your eating by say 8 o'clock in the evening, and then you wait to eat till at least noon the next day.
Right.
I think I think there's good. What do you think?
No, yeah, I think like you said, it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
And also the way you do it. Because I had bought into the intermittent fasting thing. I think it's great for you if done right.
Sure.
But I had been doing it for like 2 years, where I was like, wouldn't eat till after 12, and then like my last meal would be before like 7.
Right.
But I was only eating like 2 or 3 meals, and since I wasn't that hungry throughout the day, because I was like, my body got used to it. So I was only eating 3 meals. I was probably getting like 1,500 to 2,000 calories.
Sure.
And like my body adapted to that, and so like my hormone levels were way low than they should have been.
Yeah.
And like it's different for everybody, and then also approaching it in like a cyclical type of thing. Because if you're like looking at the way God created us and the way our ancestors lived, they were doing things that you had winter, summer, and then you ate differently according to the season.
And generally, you were doing physical labor,
Right.
Almost always.
Yeah, exactly.
And so intermittent fasting would not have worked that well then.
Yeah. But then so there's ways that we can like kind of simulate those types of things today, but it doesn't take like an engaged approach.
Yeah.
You can't just be like, oh, I'm going to pick a diet and stick to it.
Yeah.
You really have to be like purposeful in what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And
in true fasting, so IMF is one thing. IMF is really the big idea behind there is to just not engage in mindless eating.
yeah.
And so for maybe a guy like you who is seeking maybe to put on more muscle, probably IMF is not the right call because you need the calories, and your body needs, like you said, the hormone levels were off.
Yeah.
For the vast majority of Americans, though, they're probably carrying too much weight.
Oh, for sure.
And IMF can be a great opportunity to fairly easily drop off weight without having to feel like, oh, now I can't ever eat with anyone because I've got this weird, grapefruit diet that I'm following.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's where, but fasting in its historic practice would be just a form of dietary self-control where you say, okay, for 24 hours or for 48 hours, I'm going to not eat.
Yep.
And I'm going to spend, and for Christians, a good practice is every time I think about food, that's a reminder, pray.
Yeah.
That's a reminder that all food comes from God. Psalm 100, it is, we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. It's he who made us, not we.
Right.
And it's God who feeds us. And so when we experience that hunger, we go to him in prayer. And fasting is a wonderful thing to engage in, especially if there's a deep spiritual or physical need that you're facing or a decision that you're trying to figure out. As a Christian, we can solve a lot of those issues if we go to the Lord in prayer and with fasting.
Yeah, and you're touching on like all 3 areas there.
Sure, that's true.
In that, you're addressing the mental willpower that you have to have.
Yeah.
The physical aspect of like taking a break and letting your body like kind of heal itself from everything you've been eating. And then you also have the spiritual aspect of like you're focusing on something that's greater than you, and you're kind of finding your purpose in life and that type of thing. So you're addressing all 3. That's just an example of kind of what we're talking about. It's a perfect like example of these 3 areas that all work together.
Yeah.
And we can't necessarily just box these areas off and be, they come in their own time, they work separately and isolated. No, they work together.
Mm-hmm.
They're very, they work best when they're working together. And if you're looking at it from that perspective.
Yeah.
So